Welcome back to Rethinking Politics, episode 72. It is a new year and a new us. Look at us. We're still alive.
Well, my wife's been begging me to get a haircut, so it's not quite a new us yet. You know, give me a couple more weeks, guys, and I'm going to do it.
I'm going to get a haircut in the near future as well.
Once it gets down past my eyes, I'll do it. So we're almost there.
This reminds me of as I'm thinking of a new us, there's a funny Babylon Bee article that was talking about, in a stunning act of mercy, God allows the earth to continue to revolve around the sun, or like hasn't destroyed the earth this year. Cracked me up. I love satire. I love the satire articles. There's some great ones. Babylon Bee, Onion,
CNN. They're all pretty good.
That's right. All of these groups that are deliberately writing funny things about the world are wonderful. One of the things we wanted to do today, the main thing we wanted to do today,
it's like, what else do you want to do, Dan?
I was going to eat lunch at some point here and maybe exercise.
That jogging again.
Really ambitious, I know. Maybe eat lunch and maybe exercise the whole day.
It's going to be a full day for you. Slow down.
I have a lot of things to do. Now I'm feeling obligated to explain them all. I'm going to resist. We're going to go through the last year and take a look at the year
recap.
Forward. Yeah. You always say it. Year in recap, year in
review.
Year in review. I don't know why that phrase always escapes me. And we're going to look at our predictions for this last year, what happened this last year, and what we're going to get wrong about next year. So, first we'll start with President Biden and the overall political picture in the U.S. We made, going into the elections for Biden and Trump 2 years ago, I guess a year and a couple months.
A year and a half ago, yeah.
In the year of 2020, we made some predictions, and then in 2021, we talked about the future of the GOP, which we thought in particular was not in a good state.
Not looking good. Mm-hmm.
And so to recap that a little bit, we predicted, we talked about the factions within the GOP, and basically you have a Trump faction, you have a not Trump faction.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the coalitions go, you could talk about their ideological differences, their philosophical differences, which we have. But you have, in the coalition of where they align, you have the Trump group, you have a not Trump group, and you have Trump leaving in the manner that he did. And this is going to be a very big problem for future elections.
Mm-hmm.
We thought it'd be, did we say 8 to 12 years? Was that what you were saying?
Yeah, those were some of the numbers we threw out there that potentially, depending on what the GOP did, it could wreak havoc for 8 to 12 years.
Yes, and this, at the time, made perfect sense. At least I thought it did, or which is what we made the case for, right? The GOP looked like it was in a really bad position. Trump, to lose an election after 4 years of being president, we're going to talk about the next election. And, when the time comes and Biden's up for re-election, it's probably going to be a close election, judging from things as they are now.
Mm-hmm.
But it shouldn't be a close election. The incumbent president almost always wins.
Mm-hmm.
They have just a massive advantage. And you can go through and you can track. There's a funny thing where, like, they get elected for their first term. In the midterm, they lose because they're not able to carry out all their promises. But then in the next thing, they go, no, you give me a Congress, I've got these goals. And then they win their second term, and they get Congress again for a time. And there's this, it's actually this
weird ebb and flow that takes place pretty normally.
Yes. And for Trump to lose really threw it off. And for this midterm election, for Biden to lose, throws it off again, right? Things are really in flux right now. Things are just not happening in the normal manner.
And by midterm election, you mean this last year, the off.
Yes, I mean
the off-season election. I don't even know what you'd call that one.
Biden's first election that isn't as important, but it
is technically a midterm election, but usually people say midterm elections. That's not what they mean.
Yeah, they mean mid the president's term, which is
exactly,
which is
every
2 years.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so if things are odd. The GOP does actually appear, at least outside of office, to be united. And that actually is pretty common, right? It's much easier to be the opposition party. You don't have to actually put forward an agenda. You don't actually have to have a plan, right? You can just say how bad this person's doing. But one of the things we really didn't expect was just how
well, it's funny because you talk about it, and I'm looking over at our show notes, and one of the questions we asked is, can the factions be unified against a common enemy? And our answer is Biden is too lukewarm to unite against. That the problem you have is that Trump is an incredibly controversial figure.
Right.
And that's part of what we were seeing is that normally what happens is you have, when you are out of power, the attention is not on you. The attention is on what the other side is doing. And so when the Democrats are in power, the Republicans get a break. And it allows them to build political capital to use later on. But because Trump was so controversial and Biden was so lukewarm, what we predicted is an unusual circumstance where even though the Republicans are out of power, a lot of attention is still focused on the Republicans. And the beginning of this year, that was definitely true. You had the way Trump left office, January 6th, a lot of attention on that, and a lot of attention from, mainstream and legacy media focusing on Trump that was literally trying to make our prediction come true and keep that focus on the out-of-power Republicans and off of the Democrats who are in power. And if that had been successful, I think a lot of our predictions may have been closer to accurate. But instead, what happened that definitely surprised us was that Biden really, really has been kind of a failure. And he has gotten a lot of flack for it, which has allowed the attention, the spotlight to come squarely back on the Democrats and a chance for the Republicans to kind of sweep Trump under the rug a little bit and focus on just being the opposition party again.
Yeah, it's interesting. COVID-19 is one of them, right? Where the two big things three big things really that Biden's failed on. One of them is he's failed to resolve COVID-19 in a way that
any kind of way.
in any kind of way. And in some ways, this was a strategic error in that his proposed solution is not possible, right? This eliminate COVID is not possible.
Eliminate COVID and tie COVID deaths to be directly responsible. I phrased that terribly. To have the sitting U.S. president be directly responsible for any COVID deaths, which is what he said about Trump, puts him in a really awkward position as the sitting president, and as we've had more deaths in 2021 than we've had in 2020.
Yeah.
Things like that make him in a really awkward position. Things like, we have the vaccine, you need to take the vaccine, a ton of people take the vaccine, and it doesn't seem to be stopping the virus. These kinds of problems put you in a really awkward position.
Yes. And we've tracked COVID-19 through a variety of episodes, but suffice to say that all of his solutions have not actually been able to solve the problem, and they blamed the unvaccinated for a long time. The unvaccinated turns out to be a lot of people on his side. As well as others. They've tried a variety of things as you get Delta and then Omicron, and it develops and it becomes clear what should have actually been relatively clear early, which was that it would be endemic and all these other things. It has made him seem rather incompetent in the battleground of his choosing. Right? This wasn't Trump responding, trying to respond to a new event. This was Biden having been handed something, making a stand based on something he didn't have to do, and this is an unforced error, right? As they would say in like a tennis match or something. Unforced error. He's just messed up.
Which brings us to his next big unforced error, which was his withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was just a disaster from start to finish, and once again something that was really entirely up to his control.
Right.
You know, as he states, he was just honoring old promises, but those promises have been pushed off for years, and it doesn't change the fact that he chose to withdraw in the way that he did. You know, having the military leave before the civilians was just insane.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't even have to say that his problem was that he decided to withdraw. Wasn't necessarily the big decisions. It was just such poor management of all the little things that make it work. You could say what he says about vaccines and other things and make it work. You could try and, it really is, for lack of a better word, just seems to be incompetence. And it's not, you could have other leaders make the same decisions and it would play out so much better. And maybe and honestly, that may or may not even be his fault. Like when you look at how big the state is and how many things it's doing, like there's so many levels between him and where things actually happen. But that doesn't matter for optics, right? Which is what's important for the president. And that says, and maybe it says something about who he's appointing or whatever it is. The failure goes back to him. And
especially when you talk about Afghanistan, you're talking about the executive branch. You're talking about something that, you're right, he is not there on the ground deciding which bag goes where and which troop goes where, but he is making the big upper decisions that affect all the lower decisions.
That's right.
He is actually signing off on the withdrawal as it was planned. Unlike COVID-19, where he actually can't control COVID-19.
Yes.
He can control how the military withdraws. He may not have directly decided anything, but that was a decision he made. You know what I mean? To not be directly involved.
That's right.
To not look and talk to the generals and see what's happening. And that's something that has come out, that came out soon after Afghanistan, is that there were generals who said, no, there are problems that need to be addressed that weren't taken seriously.
And that we had informed them of. They're still having hearings on that to this day. Yeah, that's a great point. We should distinguish between how the country handles COVID-19, where so much of it is domestic policy. The effect of the legislature is critical. And our legislature has been AFK, as they say among computer people, or MIA, I guess, would be a more generally recognizable way to describe it for decades in terms of serious problems, because because of various problems we've discussed there, they're just absent from making the decisions that only they have the power to make. And so you're left with agencies trying to fill the gap to the degree they can, which is haphazardly without oversight and often with other incentives, and then the president taking emergency measures that are also limited in their reach. And anyway, it's the power he had over the Afghanistan events
was much more.
He could have had full control if he wanted it. He could have taken and his decisions affected everything under. And so it's much more unilateral. It is much more his.
And then the last failure on his part is one that he's actually gotten more blowback, not from the Republicans, but from
internally,
the Democrats, from the key parts of his party, is that he's failed to push big progressive agendas that he promised and that he leveraged for. A big part of the 2020 campaign was Bernie Sanders, endorsing, Joe Biden in exchange for clear promises that were made. Remember we talked about Bernie Sanders' speech talking about the concrete things that Biden was going to do for, the progressive agenda. And here we are. And as months go by, more and more of those things get dropped. I remember when the White House announces that they're no longer going to try to get minimum wage, period. You know what I mean? Like they were going to get $15 minimum wage. And they're like, we looked at it and it's going to be too hard. It wasn't like they fought hard, and through all these battles, they're like, no, it's not worth it. So we're dropping it. And then you have Build Back Better, where the progressives are like, we have to have Build Back Better be tied in with the infrastructure. And the White House once again says, no, we're just going to get infrastructure through and then we'll get Build Back Better through later. And if we happen to lose most of the things like the child tax credit or the the universal daycare, or the lower daycare costs, things like that are huge parts of the progressive agenda. Don't worry about it. And that, is a huge betrayal for the Democrats who thought they were getting someone who's going to get something done. And so the end result of all of these things is that you have a president who is able to unify the conservatives to keep them focused on an enemy instead of focusing on the division between those who were sick of Trump by the end of 22 and those who thought Trump, was their hero. Because that is a very real faction that's still there.
Right.
It's still there in the Republican Party, and it could easily resurface, come, 2024, depending on who the Democratic candidate is and depending on who the Republican candidate is. If Trump runs, that faction is going to instantly appear and become a huge issue.
Yeah.
If Trump doesn't runs, not nearly as much so. If Biden runs, there's going to be that unification against Biden. But if Biden doesn't run, if it's a completely new Democratic candidate, who knows?
Yes, we're set up for a really interesting world in terms of the big political alignments and parties. I really think that things are getting to the point where you could see new parties emerge. And again, because there's the way that elections are handled in the U.S. of the two parties and things, when I say a new party emerge, I mean an old party die, right? Because the two are going to be, for a new party, not just like a new third party that takes 1 to 5% of the vote, right? But we're talking...
No, but the party's actually shifting, so you still have two parties, but
But they may have different names or they may not, but they be fundamentally different. I'm looking at Gallup approval, disapproval ratings of Biden across the year. In January, when we made those predictions, January of last year, we talked about the GOP splitting and the threat, the serious problems the GOP would face over the next long period of time as they try and figure out who on earth they are. And as you said, we didn't think they could say, we're not Biden, and that would be good enough because Biden is too lukewarm. Here's Biden's approval rating. 57% with a disapproval rating of 37%.
That was in January?
January of 2021. By July, it's down to 50% approval rating and 45% disapproval rating. By December,
and this is all Gallup, right?
It's all Gallup. All Gallup, yeah. So I believe this is their, or is that Rasmussen? It's Gallup. So by 2021 December, last month, the approval rating is 43%. The disapproval rating is 51%. At one point, the disapproval rating was as high as 55% in November of last year. That is a shift, 57% in January to 43% approval rating, 37% disapproval to 51% disapproval. That is a massive shift in approval.
Yeah, in the first year.
In 1 year, yes, and it's fairly, it's stable for the first few months. It shifts a little bit as it always does, but then it really starts to tank around July. The disapproval rating seems to be a pretty steady increase, but the approval rating holds into the mid-50s, at least high mid-50s, and then just starts to take hits from July and August and goes out the window to the point where he is, there's a variety of ways to measure these things, but by some metrics, he is the most unpopular president, which is weird. You wouldn't think that he could do that. I didn't think he could do that. I'm kind of impressed, but it makes for a strange political future where we might have 2 4-year presidents in a row, which is really odd.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen.
Right, and I think it sets us up for Republicans, at least in the next election this year, the midterm election this year, to be able to unite in a coalition against whatever it is that Biden and company are.
Yeah, all I'm confident in saying is that we were wrong before.
Yeah.
And that these elections are going to be a lot closer than we thought they were going to be.
Yes.
I think if we've learned anything from the last couple of years, I think there are going to be a lot of curveballs.
Yeah.
And I think the political cycle is going to become much shorter. And so we're going to have much sharper upticks and downticks just in general. I don't think this is going to be unique to Biden.
Yeah.
I think...
Yeah, you're probably right.
I think one-term presidents might become more normal. I think as we become more and more politicized and more divisive, I think seeing wacky numbers like this might become more normal.
That's interesting. That would speak to a significant underlying discontent with the whole thing.
Exactly, that everyone's just unhappy.
That makes things much less stable, which can be good for positive change. It can also be dangerous, right? That's interesting. No, I think you're onto something. And it makes future predictions, like you said. We were talking about what would we predict for this year with Biden's presidency, and I don't know. there's if his approval ratings can shift so quickly, if Trump's can decline so quickly. I mean, he always had like a loyal opposition, right? But like going at the beginning of 2020,
Trump's can decline so quickly
at the beginning of 2020. With the economy pre-COVID-19.
Now I understand, yeah.
Yeah, things were looking...
And then things got out of whack
very quickly.
Fast.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, you had a period of time where things just shifted very rapidly. And then this is happening with Trump. Who knows? Who knows by 2024 where things will be?
Well, and the interesting thing with Biden is that there wasn't a new pandemic. There wasn't a new woke movement. That basically 2020 and 2021 were the same year.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That very little change between those 2 years. And that was, I think, part of the problem for Biden is that Trump was in office and then Biden was in office and nothing changed. And Biden got blamed for everything Trump got blamed.
That's true.
But my point is that you can't blame it on a new pandemic for Biden. Like you can for Trump.
Yes. New things did not.
There were no unexpected twists for Biden. You know, everything that happened that year, you know, was of his own making.
Yeah, the only twists were his own decisions, which were
exactly. Like Afghanistan was a twist, but that was a positive action on his part. So you can't say he was surprised by that.
Yeah. Which brings us to the big story of the year, which we're already partially discussing, which is COVID-19. The big story of this year, the big story or last year, I guess, 2021. It's now 2022. And the big story of the year before.
Luckily, here we are in January of 2022, and COVID's about wrapped up, so we probably will never have another episode about it again. So this is kind of a wrap-up for COVID as we're looking back at this disease.
True. I hope that's true.
This is pure sarcasm over here.
I know. There are some signs that could be the case. I see the CDC changing its guidelines for how many days you are to quarantine,
which is funny because they've been very upfront about the fact that they're changing them for non-disease related reasons. Has nothing to do with how the virus has changed. Has nothing to do with how infectious it is. It is purely well, you could call it purely an economic decision, but I would call it a political one.
Yes.
That people are fed up with lots of things, and so they're trying to placate people, and I think it's backfiring. Because the whole argument for the past 2 years is, well, we need to follow the science, and we need to do what's right for health. And now Fauci is saying, well, it's just a matter of what people can tolerate. It's like, well, where has that been for the past 2 years? Now, all of a sudden... You know, here at this point, you don't care anymore.
Yeah, health isn't important, but it's been so paramount that we would discard everything else. Yeah.
Like that 180, I think it's going to be one that's hard for a lot of people who have bought in to the fear and bought into, okay, what do we need to do? I can trust you as a source, CDC, Anthony Fauci, as someone's going to tell me what I can do to stay safe, has now been told, actually, we only care about keeping you safe if it's politically feasible, and it's no longer politically feasible.
Yeah.
That's going to be a huge betrayal of the only people who are still listening to the CDC at this point.
Yes. Which is a good point. The audience they have is going to be the only people that are going to be upset about this, which is... Yeah,
because all the people who didn't care anyways haven't been listening to the CDC for months. Yeah,
it's an interesting dilemma. Like you said, if you say, look, we've looked at the variety of factors, and in this case, it makes sense to prioritize health in these circumstances because the cost of other things doesn't outweigh health at this point. You can then adapt from there. You can say these other variables, as the variables shift, the math comes out different. But no, they said, forget every other variable, forget every other factor. What's important is stopping this, and we do that by keeping you isolated for X amount of time based on scientific recommendations. At that point, you can't change it. You can't change it without looking
unless
like
the science changes.
Yes.
If you say, hey, we've looked at the data and you're not infectious for 10 days, therefore we don't need to quarantine you for 10 days, that would be different.
Yes.
But that's not what they're saying. They're saying you're still infectious, so when you go back to work, wear a mask, even though the data on a cloth mask is not very conclusive. You know what I mean?
I
Like,
love
it doesn't
the way they
make
phrase
sense.
it in articles. Yes, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, they've to give a full explanation of why they've changed it, they have to say we have been taking into account other factors, and those other factors are why we're doing this, and actually make a case that but then to do that undoes so much of the other claims they've made, and they'd have to say we've actually changed our minds about how we've been going about calculating which decisions ought to be politically enforced with regards to health and the trade-offs that are happening. And none of this is a road they want to go down, but they're forced to go down it for political purposes at this point, and it just makes them look like they're hypocrites, like they're betraying the sacred trust of science.
It's a really odd capstone for the last 2 years, and the official response, from the NIH, from the CDC, from, Anthony Fauci, because these are the people who are talking about this change right now and defending it. Having this as a capstone really, for me, is quite vindicating, because it vindicates what we've been saying. I mean, we've had too many episodes about COVID in the past year. I remember when we had our very first COVID episode, which was episode 3 back in 2020. And we're like, it looks like this thing's sticking around. I guess we should address it.
That's right,
here we are mentioning COVID, at least in passing, for the 30th time. But we've talked about many different things and how convoluted and how politically motivated so many responses to COVID have been. And this is vindicating because they've really, at this point, I think they have lost almost all of their credibility. And it's going to be interesting to see what the COVID story in 2022 looks like, as such a huge proportion of the population no longer knows who to listen to. A great example of this is all the legacy media talking about Omicron and talking about how mild the symptoms are, while at the same time talking about how dangerous it is and how scared we should be. And it just doesn't work,
Yeah, he showed me a gem of an article on that. He told me about
where the article was literally saying how
all the signs,
in general, all the signs point to mild symptoms, and this was, the headline was something like, but severe symptoms could be even worse. And their argument for why it could hypothetically be worse was because Omicron was new, we're not sure if all of the previous treatments would work. And so even though there's no evidence that Omicron's going to be severe, they posted an article talking about the potential for it to be even more severe.
We found...
Just hypothetically, you know what I mean?
We found a hole in the data in which we can fearmonger.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's like when you wrote that article, your goal from the beginning was for Omicron to be scary. You found out a way that it could potentially be scary, and then went with that, ignoring the fact that you've had so many cases of Omicron with mild symptoms, so few hospitalizations reported with Omicron. It's just mind-boggling.
It is. Here's my optimistic prediction for COVID-19 in 2022. I don't think it will be the biggest story of the year next year. I don't think it will. I think it'll still be a story, but I think it will be relatively minor.
You think when we're recapping 2022?
When we're recapping 2022, I don't think it will be that important. 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 I don't think It will still probably be important politically because people will be talking for years about how we responded, how we need to be ready for the next thing like it. But in terms of its actual impact on people from day to day, I think we're near the end.
See, I disagree. I disagree, Dan. I don't think
Don't
you're
crush.
right. I think
I have a small bit of hope in me, Brad. Don't crush it.
if we were doing a recap a year from now, like we're doing right now,
Okay.
if it's not one of the top 2 stories, I'm going to be very surprised of 2022. I think that it's going. I think, regardless of well, you're distinguishing things in an interesting way. You're saying there's going to be political ramifications and they're going to be day-to-day ramifications. And I don't think we can separate those two. Because as someone who's gotten COVID this year, as someone who's, lived a relatively normal life this year, I can confidently say that the vast majority of my interruptions from COVID were man-made. You know what I mean? That the biggest influence that COVID had on me this year was not getting COVID. You know what I mean? That was not my story with COVID this year. Had nothing really to do with that, week and a half I spent quarantining while having COVID. It was all about the other aspects of it.
Yes. So,
and that is going to linger,
You're
and
right.
therefore COVID is going to be one of the biggest stories of 2022, regardless of how many people are actually dying and actually being hospitalized. In many ways, that hasn't mattered for a while now.
Yes. There's a lot of truth to that. Yeah. Let me explain the distinction I was making because I see why. You're absolutely right. The vast majority of the effects of COVID-19 have always been political effects, not the actual disease. They've been the way that rules and things have been implemented around them. They've changed colleges completely. They've changed a variety of work industries completely, right?
Yeah, I mean, public education for children has been wrecked the past 2 years
by
with long-term consequences for kids who are growing up during this time that we won't be able to calculate for a long time. It has nothing to, and that's nothing to do with whether or not the virus is killing a lot of kids.
You're right. I guess if I were to amend what I was saying or to specify what I was thinking was, well, it will still be in, political conversations will still be about COVID and the effects of them and how we remedy that and those things and how we recover from it and how we prepare for the next pandemic and all of those kind of things. I think the news on it will decrease. But as I'm saying that from what you said,
still disagree.
I think you're right. I think my hope is my optimism officially crushed. You're right. COVID-19 is going to be a big story this year. Probably top 2. You're right.
Sorry, Dan.
No, because they're gonna run on it for elections again. It will be the political fuel for at least a couple more years, and then it will fade to the level I was thinking, where it's more like the white papers and things that are still discussing it and political insiders. You're right. Sorry to get everybody's hopes up. I've been hoping that it goes away. I have a distinct bias here in that I really want it to go away. I hate discussing it. Anyway, COVID, our formal prediction, Brad's right. COVID-19 is still a thing. Any other dreams you'd like to crush here?
No, one per episode's good for me.
One per episode. Okay. All right. What about January 6th?
It's funny, Dan, we never actually had an episode specifically about January 6th.
But certainly one of the biggest stories. Do you agree with that? Not our story.
No, I'm just laughing because do you agree with that? You're ready for me to disagree with you again, but I already established, once per episode. Yes, Dan, this has been a very large ongoing story this entire year. I mean, even recently with the court hearings and proceedings that have gone on recently with January 6th, continues to be a big story.
It is. Inside a lot of Riot's a big story is that they're hoping it will unearth. As long as the investigation continues, you can draw on it as you're still free to speculate in ways that you can't speculate once it's concluded. Now there will always be people who have claim insider knowledge or straight up conspiracy theories about what happened and what was revealed. My favorite things to read about in relation to this is speculation about how many of them were feds. That always cracks me up, especially since whenever it does come out who the feds were in any particular crazy thing that happens, it's always more than I expected. It's always like they were always playing a more direct role than you would have thought was legal. But anyway, January 6th has been a big story. We never addressed it in a specific episode because...
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned it, but we haven't had a whole episode dedicated to it.
I guess we did talk about it at length right when it happened. And we talked about how it was, well, it looked like a riot. We talked about how it wasn't an attempt to overthrow the government.
Yeah, it wasn't a coup. I mean, that's what's been so fascinating about this coverage, and is worth mentioning again one more time, and part of why we haven't given it so much coverage, is that people have gone above and beyond to paint it as a coup, while very carefully wording everything they say about it, because there's no evidence of that. You know what I mean? And so that goes from, you have all these people who have stood trial, you have people who have been sentenced. No one has been sentenced with insurrection as far as I know. Yeah. No one's been sentenced with anything really much more severe than trespassing, and there's a term for it, but it's basically disrupting government process. You know what I mean? That the legislature was in session and you stopped that, which is a crime. And that's basically all that anyone's been charged with, as far as I know, because that's all there's evidence for. Because what you had was a protest, like protests that have been going on for all of 2020, but those were more politically acceptable. And you had a protest that evolved into a riot, and you had people who stormed, the Capitol building, which is such another one of those fun terms because it's trying to sound like
military or something.
Like a military coup, but this is just something that happens all the time when people are unhappy with their government. I mean, when we...
outside of the building.
Our episode 6, back in 2020, long before January 6th, we talk about the protests and the riots. And because the riots have been something that's been associated with the protests for a long time. And we talk about the fact that this is actually basically a traditional American practice. It's not even an American practice, but something that people have always done in responding to what they consider bad government, is to respond with violence. You know what I mean? That's not unusual. And January 6th is not unusual. What's unusual about it is how it's been portrayed, how it's been written, how the story has been told about how really it was a coup that was organized by Donald Trump. And the evidence for that is the 3 hours it took him to respond. And none of this really tells us, there's no evidence for it being a coup. There really isn't.
Right.
What their evidence is for what it was, which was a bunch of angry people, which is a riot, and a bunch of people storming a building because they're upset, which is the same thing that happened in Portland, 24 times. Same thing that happened across the country. There were many government buildings that were raided. None of those were coups. You know what I mean? When they broke into the city building, they weren't trying to stop the government or decapitate the rulers. They were just upset and they were rioting. And that's what happened here. And painting it as something else is dishonest.
It is. I still wonder how doing that leads to a coup. Doing that in isolation. So many elements. What do they then? They then what? Form their own legislature and start making laws, and where does it go from here? But no, obviously there was no overall plan to do something significant from there.
It's kind of like how people talk about the fact that Trump didn't willfully give up his power. You know what I mean? That there wasn't a peaceful transition of power between Trump and Biden, which is nonsense because Biden's in power and Trump is not.
There was no war.
Yeah, there was no war. At no point did Trump order his generals. You know what I mean? At no point did Trump issue a command to stop the transition of power, which he could have done. He could have issued that command. Would it have been followed?
I doubt it.
I don't think
Yeah.
so. But the point is
Yeah.
if he had issued the command and no one listened,
Then
that
you
would
could
be
say,
different.
yes.
Then you can say, okay,
Yeah, he would have been arrested.
Something serious happened here, and Trump did try and perform a coup, because at that point it would be some form of coup.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's just not what happened.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of Democrats were upset that it didn't happen. They really wanted it to happen because it would have given them so much ammunition and so much vindication, but it just didn't.
I read a depressing article. I should have saved it and shared it with you. That was talking about how someone said, I thought I had seen the most horrific day in American history when I lived through 9/11. And then I lived long enough to see January 6th. They were dead serious. This was not satire. At least not any more satire than CNN articles. And I couldn't... I don't know what to do with that. other than the same thing I do with QAnon, right? I shrug my shoulders, and if I run into someone who actually believed it, I would try and help them. But it's I don't know what to tell you. January 6th was not a coup, and it certainly wasn't the worst thing that's happened in a long time. I read another article the other day. I was thinking about doing an episode on January 6th again, because people are still talking about it. There's still major headlines at places like CNN and other outlets like them. And they were talking about, they were discussing, I lost my train of thought.
The one you were telling me about earlier about the new information about what Trump was doing during that time.
First-hand witnesses that he really did know about it and didn't do anything for a while. No, that was not the one, but that one's funny too in its own way, where you're trying so hard to
imply things
that you don't have evidence for, but the bias of the particular audience can supply it, right? They believe Trump is evil and wanted to take over the government. So anything he doesn't do, I mean, really, you can interpret then anything he does in that light, if that's what if that's your assumption. But that is an assumption, and it's an assumption upon which there's little basis other than silly things Trump says, which he says all the time about all kinds of things. But anyway, I was trying to find reasons to discuss it and to look at the substantial things that came from it. But nothing substantial has come. Like Brad said, there have been light charges on some people. There have been some people who were clearly involved who have not been charged with anything, and there's good reason to suspect they were feds. There are little stories there, but nothing of substance other than to say it was not a coup. It was not... this is what the article said. I remember now. Last thing on this. It was talking about how they have never seen a violent riot like this in America. And I thought, like you don't even, not only could you go back to just the year before and look at places like Kenosha on fire, but like you were saying earlier, like riots are not actually that uncommon. Now, they're not normal in the way that they are in some places. They're news in the U.S., whereas in some places it's kind of constant.
Yeah, but have we ever gone even 1 year without a single riot? I don't think we have in the United States. We definitely haven't gone a significant period of time without national newsworthy riots.
Yeah. It's just interesting. People who are under the impression this event is singular when it's not. It is odd that they got into the legislature, right?
No, there are real questions about security for Congress because there's so many videos of these people just walking through the halls, which is part of why it's calling it a coup and why they're not getting charged with more serious things, because these people didn't have to either physically or whatever, shoot down a dozen armed guards to get into this hallway. They were able just to walk down it.
Yeah, most of them are unarmed and walking
know.
around. Yeah, which should not be possible. There is something disturbing about it in that way, right? And that they could have been threatening senators and legislators and so on, but that doesn't make it more than what it was.
Mm-hmm.
The last major set of, I guess, trend of stories that we went through this year that we wanted to talk about is a series of court cases, not Supreme Court cases, which has obviously been talked about a lot, and there were some major developments there, and there may yet be more developments, right? But it's slow.
Yeah, but 2021 has been the year of criminal court cases that have received a ton of attention.
They really have. Starting with George Floyd, for obvious reasons, and Derek Chauvin.
Well, starting with Derek Chauvin, yeah.
Derek Chauvin. Mm-hmm. George Floyd being killed, Derek Chauvin being on trial for his murder. And as that one played out, as that one spawned an entire movement, it was ground zero for Black Lives Matter gaining traction as a movement that then really took over for a long time in terms of news and influence. That one makes sense as the first point at which everyone's watching the case and how it's going to develop. And when it finally came to the trial, we were all there watching and following it very closely. And I think that in part explains why all of the other ones then got attention. Well, I mean, part of it is that the general story is that police interactions are the problem, right? So you're going to watch the police cases, but it's also that I think after watching several cases, people want more cases. like it's an interesting Law and Order has become a reality.
And true crime podcasts have exploded in the past 2 years. It's a huge growing genre. But you're right, there's something that's changed in the public's perception. I think part of it has to do with we haven't increased our focus on criminal justice. You know what I mean? That we're aware of injustices that occur on a regular basis in these court cases. And so we're much more interested in seeing what happens versus maybe 20, 30 years ago, where we would just read the verdict and say, okay, well, there you go. You know what I mean? There are so many more cases that are taking place today that are like the OJ trial, where the country is split on what the correct verdict is, on what actually is happening and whether or not it's justice. And so that kind of trial is taking place on a regular basis now, where it is incredibly controversial. And I mean, one of the other ones we got a lot of coverage on was the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And that trial was a lot like that, where people were so cleanly divided on something that maybe they shouldn't have been.
Right. Kyle Rittenhouse is a good one because the basic facts were so confused and so
unimportant.
And they should have been important. They should have been known, at least, by the people discussing them and by the journals that with lots of resources that they were spending and that were frequently writing about it. Turned out they didn't know much about it at all. And even to the point where they were where people reading their articles were assuming things that were obviously untrue, like the victims were black.
Yeah, the European headlines that actually had Kyle Rittenhouse killing, 2 black men because they were basing them off of the U.S. articles, which strongly implied it.
Yes,
so they just assumed.
Yes, which were deliberately implying it. Yes, yeah, it's interesting. We mentioned. You then had like Jacob Blake, which spawned the Kenosha event, right? Jacob Blake in Kenosha, and Breonna Taylor, who was killed when the police were firing at her boyfriend Kenneth. Other cases later, the Ahmaud Arbery case with the guys that were following
which took
him.
place, close to the Kyle Rittenhouse. And was another interesting one, absolutely.
Right, and turns out they were ruled unjustified in their attempt to kind of do a citizen's arrest and then self-defense claim when it went south. One of the most interesting ones that I think is a good trend in terms of self-defense and interactions with the police was the Arthur Coffey IV, which you know much better than I do.
Yeah, so Arthur Coffey IV, he actually was acquitted on most of his charges soon after Kyle Rittenhouse, is around the same time in November. His case took place years before. I think it was 2017. Another case to put in our books for speedy trials being a thing of wishful thinking and not reality.
Yes.
But regardless of his bail status, I don't care. There's 4 years is far too long. But he's at home in his bedroom. The SWAT hit his window with I think there's a better term for this, but it's basically a boomstick. It's a long pole with a special explosive attached to the end that hits the window, shattering the window, and basically flashbanging the entire room simultaneously. Very effective tool, very loud, sounds a whole lot like a gunshot that shot through the window.
The goal is basically to disorient you, blind you,
deafen disorient, blind, deafen you, all at the same time, as well as clearing an entrance into the room. Which sounds exactly like gunfire. So he grabs his gun off his nightstand, fires some shots out the window, doesn't hit anyone, and the SWAT team responds by unloading into the room, killing a woman in the room with him. And he ends up getting tried for second degree murder for his girlfriend, as well as getting charged with attempted first degree murder of the police officers. And all of those charges get dropped. The only charge he gets convicted of is having a weapon as a convicted felon. So he shouldn't have had the weapon in the first place, which that case is pretty open and shut because he fired it. But all of the self-defense arguments, he won every single one. And it was really interesting to have that case happen at the same time as the Kyle Rittenhouse case, because everyone argued that Kyle Rittenhouse only got off because of white supremacy, that you had this white judge who was looking out for Kyle, their buddy, the white judge even had a
pro-Trump,
a loosely Trump-themed ringtone because it was a patriotic song that had been associated with Trump in the past, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have Arthur Coffey IV, who is not white. He's a black man who, pleads self-defense after, shooting at police officers, and gets off because he had a legitimate self-defense case, and that maybe it's not actually just about race and there are other issues here. Doesn't change the fact that there are serious problems with the criminal justice system, something that we've said in the past and it's worth reiterating again. There are serious problems. The fact that Arthur Coffey IV had to wait 4 years for his trial date, regardless of the outcome, is a very serious problem.
Right.
You know what I mean? Problems that are worth looking at. We talked about a couple other cases briefly around the Kyle Rittenhouse case that demonstrate the injustice of our current criminal justice system.
Yes. I became aware of cases like Arthur Coffey IV's, must have been 7-8 years ago when I first heard about those kind of cases. Cases where
the cases with SWAT.
Cases where SWAT or the police are carrying out a no-knock raid of some kind, where they're simply barging in, or breaking in through a window, whatever it may be, and engaging in gunfights then, because the person reacts fast enough to grab a weapon, with a civilian suspected of a crime, an alleged criminal. When I first heard about them, every case that I heard about where they tried to plead self-defense, they tried to say, look, I had no idea I was firing at police officers, right? I thought I was under attack. I'm fighting back. They were found guilty of things like murdering police officers.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Arthur Coffey IV was found innocent, and that this appears to be a trend, this is not an isolated thing,
is a good step
awesome.
In the right direction.
Yes, that's great. The no-knock raids need to happen in we've talked about it before, but you need to extremely restrict the circumstances. If someone's life is not in danger right now, you shouldn't have a no-knock raid.
Yeah, because right now the argument is if we knock on their door, they're going to flush the drugs down the toilet. And you need to ask yourself, is that worth a firefight where who knows how many bystanders are going to die? Like in this case, Arthur Coffey IV, someone still died.
Yes.
The police killed an innocent woman, as far as we know. I don't know anything about her backstory, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But she's dead, and there's no recompense for that.
Yeah. The most egregious case I heard, they had knocked on the wrong door. They were at the wrong address. Guy had nothing to do with it. Defends himself, kills a police officer.
I like that they knocked on the door for their no-knock raid. It's
they
very
probably
innovative.
did knock on the door, hit the door, or whatever it is they do.
Sorry, I couldn't help it.
Even the knock raids can be very dangerous, right? Depending, because often they don't hear them, or they.
No, and that's why I mean
themselves.
Breonna Taylor became famous. Famous is not the right term, but her case, her story became famous because that's what happened. Is there's an innocent person who is killed by police.
Yes.
As they're conducting this no-knock raid that shouldn't have happened.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That we should all be able to agree just shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, it puts we may have to revisit. We've talked about reforming these kind of things. Worth revisiting again in light of these cases, because there's more and more momentum for it, more public attention. Most recently, you have two new cases that have just been resolved. You have Ghislaine Maxwell, who was Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend /
Accomplice.
That's the word I'm looking for.
You're welcome.
And Elizabeth Holmes, who was a billionaire.
Yeah, completely unrelated cases.
Unrelated cases, yes. And not similar to any of the other ones listed. Ghislaine Maxwell's high profile for obvious reasons, being with Jeffrey Epstein and Jeffrey Epstein's potential political connections. It's been resolved with her being found guilty on 5 out of 6 charges. It should be sufficient to put her away for life, I believe. I haven't looked into the details, but if it's not, I'll be shocked.
Sorry, I'm just trying to not make a Jeffrey Epstein suicide joke about how long you need to put her away for it to be life. Carry on. So you're saying 2-3 months? That's all you need.
You need 10 minutes unsupervised is all it is. Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself.
It's my bad.
There's no way the series of things that went wrong. Anyway, neither here nor there. But I guess related to Jeffrey Epstein's murder in jail, is the fact that the Ghislaine Maxwell trial did not actually pin it on anybody else. There's no other. As far as I know, it's possible that there are low-level ones I missed. I haven't followed it too closely, but no high-profile person has been incriminated and is now being accused of crimes through the revelations that have come out through the Ghislaine Maxwell case.
Which seems odd, at least.
Yes, so it appears that it will stop here for now, which everyone knows it shouldn't, but thus it is. Elizabeth Holmes is interesting and different, and I haven't actually followed the case so much as heard other people who are obsessed with following it.
Yeah, and so it's a big fraud case.
Right.
She has this startup company, has to deal with this innovative way of blood testing. There's a Wall Street Journal article that comes out exposing it as being some kind of hoax, which of course causes the company to implode. And then immediately as the company implodes, charges get filed against basically all of the executives. And of course the question then becomes, what did you know? When did you know it? Because obviously just having a failing business is not a criminal offense, but if you were deceptive in how you imploded that business, it very well can be. And so that then becomes the question for that case. She's found guilty on several charges, I believe.
Yes.
And
she's been found guilty of fraud at several levels. I saw a 20-year jail sentence, and several other.
Well, because she hasn't been sentenced yet for.
Yes, I don't. Yeah, it's not a formal sentence. You're right. Yeah. You're right. Not a formal sentence. I saw speculation of it.
Up to
20 years.
I know several of them had up to 20 years.
Yeah, based on the charges that she was found guilty of, and several other charges that the jury did not decide, and the judge has declared a mistrial on. I'm not familiar with how this works in this, but presumably those other cases. Got a cat walking onto my lap. Those other cases. Those other accusations will be tried by another court at a later time. And so, yeah, I feel like there's probably a different term depending on the states. I've never heard mistrial applied in that context, but I'm not a trial attorney either, so. But that's where that one stands. Now, we have another trial coming down the pipelines, hopefully not in 4 years, of Daryl Brooks Jr., whose crime recently caught a lot of attention as he drove an SUV through a parade. Obviously horrific. I'm curious what will be revealed as, by the through the court process. But at this point, the trial is in the future, likely going to be another one that at least conservatives are very closely watching.
Yeah, and so as these court cases come about, I'm interested to see what happens in 2022 in terms of our newfound fascination with the criminal justice system. I'd love to see not just morbid fascination, but maybe some interest in amending a lot of the laws and a lot of the structure that's currently set up, because it's not good. And seeing these cases should help people realize there are a lot of flaws in a lot of areas where there could be significant improvement, and maybe we can see some actual changes. I'm not super hopeful with that, but there is some hope. So,
Yes.
and we have seen some positive signs. The Arthur Coffey 4 was a positive sign. The attorney for the one girl, and I forgot her name, I should have written it down, who killed her kidnapper.
Yes.
Who, after the Kyle Rittenhouse case, said they were planning on appealing using some
That's
of those
right.
same
We
arguments.
talked about it when we talked domestic abuse and things. Yes.
Yeah, and hopefully that sees some changes there, because those laws could also use some reform. But we'll have to see.
Yeah, ideally that is where this energy and attention is channeled into, right? That people are able to capitalize on the interest and actually make some improvements. There are some real injustices in.
Yeah, and what we don't want to see is that instead the court system is encouraged to become a witch hunt, as all that matters is whether or not you're on the right side of history and whether or not you're guilty or innocent.
Yes.
That Elizabeth Holmes and Kyle Rittenhouse are both guilty because they're both representatives of the oppressing class, whether that's white supremacy on Kyle Rittenhouse
or billionaires
the rich,
yeah.
With Elizabeth Holmes, that we know she's guilty because her company, because she's, cost many people their fortunes, whether or not she did it knowingly doesn't really matter. You know what I mean?
Yes. I really hope that people are watching these cases close enough to try and determine the justice of this case based on the details of the case, rather than on the social groups that are involved, right? Mm-hmm. That it becomes a quest for more accurately getting individual justice, rather than a quest to for equalization of justice or some kind of social justice where your group determines your guilt. Because
that was definitely a disturbing trend this year.
Yeah, if we see reforms,
social justice,
can you imagine a state that starts to take that seriously? And I guess to some degree, states like California have begun to, where they're like, actually, we're going to let out all these prisoners in this particular city because to equalize the rates of different racial things. And certainly there are too many people in prison. That's not the question. But if you were going to select who you were going to let out, that's not a good basis for it at all. Right? That's nothing. That's unrelated to which people shouldn't be in there and which people shouldn't be in there. And it's simple. It has the appeal of being like, oh yeah, we can actually run these numbers really easy. But that would be a terrible solution. The other one I keep hearing about is restorative justice. We did an episode on restorative justice. And what I would say is the restorative justice. At this point, the term has been, every time I hear it, it's as a pejorative from Republicans talking about Democrats who don't want justice, who just want to let people commit crimes.
Which is not at all what we were talking about when we were discussing restorative justice.
Right. You could vastly improve the justice system by having an alternative route through the justice system when both the victim and the criminal are willing to come together and to work things out. It could be entirely different. You could have much higher goals when the participants are willing. You could aim for things like reconciliation, redemption, reformation in ways that you simply can't if both parties are not willing. Right. And they don't want to interact. They don't want to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. And right now we treat every interaction with crime and with the police as if the person is resistant to the idea of going straight in their life, leading a life without crime and without harming other people. And it's a fundamentally different thing. And something I think about a lot, but we haven't revisited it in the podcast. I think it would solve a lot of the problems with retention and recidivism. I think it would solve a lot of the problems with society in general, and making peace amongst ourselves and getting to know our neighbors and getting, more social and moral issues in terms of community and these other things. I think it would change a lot of society in a really powerful way to have that available. But you don't do that by discarding the idea that some people ought to be compelled and thrown in jail, and some people have to be punished in other ways. And it's two different systems that can exist simultaneously, and you don't simply let everybody out on low bail or let everybody bail reform. We've mentioned we've got a lengthy list at this point of criminal justice related reforms that maybe we'll have to compile in a more systematic way and put all together.
Might be, yeah. It would be worth visiting at some point.
Yeah, because it's really interesting, and there's obviously a lot of attention, and all of the progress on this, or at least the vast majority of it, comes at state levels. And so you don't move this through the federal political parties, except to the degree that it's related to federal crimes. Some things are going to be solved there, but a lot of the details of the interactions are going to be solved at the state levels.
I have a lot of responses to that, but I don't want us to get too sidetracked into having a discussion of criminal justice all over again. So
yes, as we're talking about this,
for a
we
later
need to do
episode.
another episode on this, yeah, at some point in the future.
But in the meantime, as we kind of wrap up our wrap-up over here, looking back at politics, in particular Biden, Trump, and the political divide there, looking back at COVID, January 6th, then also these court cases, criminal court cases, and how they're shaping the political narrative. Looking at all of that, looking into 2022, we've seen some good trends that we'd like to continue. Some of the positive criminal justice changes, but in general, we've seen a whole lot of bad trends. So I'm not super full of hope for 2022. Yeah. I know this is a little bit pessimistic as we're coming into it, but I also think that that's just the reality. Yeah. You know what I mean? There's going to be it's going to be a little bit ugly in 2022, kind of like 2021 was after 2020. Yeah. This is not a clean slate. Most of the baggage we've gone through in the past year is going to stick with us through this next year. And so hopefully we can find some ways to get past that in this next year, and we'll look out for those glimmering lights. But in the meantime, hang in there.
Right. The trends towards chaos are to some degree a trend towards potential, but that potential's often in a negative
Still
direction.
Has to be realized.
Yeah.
Oh, and that too.
Yeah, and yes, and it has to be seized. You have to actually channel it into something and get the attention, get a unified group pushing for something specific. And that's not easy.
And with that, thank you for listening.
We'll see you next time.
This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.